We've been exploring what it means to be human, or what it means to be real. There's that story about a king who, after a day looking after the concerns of state, would oftentimes don a disguise and go out into his kingdom to check on his subjects, what was happening and what was abroad at the time. But on one occasion he went out and he found 4 young maidens sitting by a well having a discussion about the meaning of pleasure. And one of them said, "Oh, the greatest pleasure is drinking wine." And the second one said, "No, no, 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 no. The greatest pleasure is eating meat." And the third one said, "No, no, no. The greatest pleasure is lovemaking." And the fourth maiden said, "Well, you're all wrong, because the greatest pleasure is telling a lie." Now, after hearing this, the king was quite curious. So he noted where each of the maidens returned to their house, and he put a mark on their door, so that the next day he sent messengers to that household to ask that their daughter, the maiden, be brought to the palace. Well, of course, coming from the culture that they did, the man of the house was reluctant to let their daughter go to the palace. This was very unseemly, but the king sent a messenger to say, "No, no, no, it's all above board, there's nothing to worry about." And he actually sent palanquins with curtains on them so that the maidens could be brought to the palace. He said, "You don't have any worry about their well-being." So he called each maiden to him, and he said, "Well, I heard your conversation of the last evening, and I want to know what you mean by saying that the greatest pleasure is drinking wine." Because he said to the first young maiden, "I know that you're the daughter of a priest and you eschew any kinds of alcohol at all, so how do you know about the pleasure of drinking wine?" And she said, "Well, we live across the road from a tavern, and I have seen these rich men come, and they go into the tavern and they drink a lot of wine, and when they come out they stagger along the road and they fall over, and then they get up again, but they come back again and again and again. So I can presume from this that drinking wine is the greatest of pleasure." And so he gave this maiden a substantial gift and sent her on her way, and called the next maiden to him and asked the same question. And the maiden said, "Well, we weren't talking about you." And the king said, "Yes, yes, I know, but do tell me, what did you mean by saying that the greatest pleasure is eating meat? Because I know that you come from a certain faith, and you don't touch any meat at all. Even your families are not have to inspect everything to see there's not even an ant on your food." And she said, "Well, we live nearby a butcher shop, and I've observed that when people buy their meat, they cook and eat the meat, and then they give the bones to the dog, and the dog eats the bone, and then the crows come to pick the marrow from the bones, and then the ants come to eat what remains. So I take from that the greatest pleasure is eating meat." And so he gave her a gift and sent her on her way, and then he called the next maiden and asked her the same question. And he actually had to ask her, "Well, what is your background?" And she said, "I'm the daughter of a bard." And he said, well, what did you mean by saying you're so young, you don't know anything about love-making? Why did you say that love-making is the greatest pleasure? And she said, well, my mother gave birth to my brother, and she screamed and yelled, and it was obviously so painful. But very soon afterwards, she went back to her job of being a dancing girl and invited her lovers in night after night, as she had done before. So I'm presuming that lovemaking is the greatest pleasure of all. So he also gave her a gift and sent her on her way and called the fourth maiden to him. And he said, well, what did you mean saying that the greatest pleasure is telling a lie? And she was rather a smart young being, quite wily, you might say. And she said to the king, well, if you give me 4 lakhs of gold and 6 months, I will prove to you that lying is the greatest pleasure. So, taking her up on this, he gave her the gold, and she went off on her way. And after the 6 months were off, he called her to him and said, now, what is it, the meaning of this? And she said, well, come with me. So she went in the company of the king and several of his ministers to where, with the money that she'd been given, she'd built a rather substantial house. And she said to the king and his ministers, now, in this house is where God lives. And when you enter this house, you will see God. But you can only go one by one, and you have to remember that you can only see God if you're not a bastard. So the king said to one of his ministers, well, you go first. And the minister went in, and of course in the house it was decorated in the most beautiful way. It was very serene, and certainly when the minister looked around, he said, oh yes, certainly I can believe that God lives here, but I can't see him. I wonder, I really don't know what my background is. I don't know whether I could be a bastard or not, but how could I admit that? I wouldn't want anyone to know. So when he came out, he was asked, well, did you see God? And he said, well, yes, I did. And the king said, well, did he speak to you? And the minister said, well, yes, he did, but he told me I wasn't allowed to tell anyone what it was that we spoke about. So the second minister went in, and the same kind of thing happened. He felt very peaceful and looked around very carefully, but there was no sign of God present. And then he's thinking to himself, well, yes, it's possible. I don't know my heritage, but if my friend saw God, then I have to pretend that I saw God too. So when he came out, the same thing happened. He was questioned. He said, yes, I saw God and he spoke to me. Yes, but I can't tell you what it was that he said. So it was the turn of the king to go into the house, and when he entered, of course, he felt the great serenity and tranquility that was there, but there was no sign of God. And he thought to himself, well, I know my heritage, I know my father and my father's father, and there's no doubt that I'm not a bastard, but I don't know. But I have to admit I can't lose face in front of my ministers and the people who would cause all kinds of trouble if I went out and admitted. So when he came out, And when he was asked, the young woman asked him, well, did you see God? He said, yes, I saw God and spoke to him. And so, very pointedly, the young woman said to the king and his ministers, how can you see God when God is not something? God is spirit. And then she turned to the king and said to him rather pointedly, you know, as poor people, we oftentimes have to lie to ourselves to convince ourselves of something, or even lie to save our lives. But you're a king. Why did you have the need to lie? Now, instead of being angry with the young maiden, he realized that a very profound truth was being revealed to him. So rather than punish her, he took her into his palace, and we know the rest of the story. He made her his queen, and she became his personal beloved and advisor. But the question that arises, of course, from this story is not what is its deep meaning for us in our exploration of what it means to be human, or what it means to be real. And for this we have to, again, as always, revert to our own experience. What is our experience of lying, and the reason for this? I cannot tell you how many times over these many years that there have been those who have come to visit, and they've said, "Oh, I had a perfect childhood. My parents loved me." But then, as truth came out, there were stories of being beaten, of a father who was an alcoholic, abused the mother, and the mother who abused the child, and many, many other stories. But first came out the lie, and then came out the truth. What does this story contribute to our exploration into what it means to be human, or what it means to be real? What is our experience of lying?